So let me just do some introductions. My name is Leanne Worsfold, and I'm one of the facilitators for today's session. And I've been working with the college for about 6 months now and helping them develop their quality assurance tools. I've worked with numerous regulatory bodies across Ontario, but also across Canada for about 15 years, and was the manager of the quality assurance program for the opticians, as well as the co-lead for the QA program at the nurses. And Lena, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Lena Martinen, and I'm the manager of quality assurance at the college. I've been working with the college for over 4 years now, maybe closer to 5 years now, in various capacities, but have most recently in 2014 been assigned to QA.
Okay. Good. So what we're going to be talking about today is specifically the professional development tools, a component of the quality assurance program. So initially, we'll give you an overview of the quality assurance program and legislative requirements. And then Lena's going to walk you through the actual tools themselves, the professional development tools, and give you some insight on filling out the forms and doing a little bit of troubleshooting, but also the critical thinking behind completion of the tool. We would also like to outline for you your professional obligations in regards to completing the tools as part of this pilot test, as your ongoing obligations will be different than your participation in the pilot. We will talk about the random selection process, so some of you engaged in this pilot test will be randomly selected, either for review of the tools, that the college will undergo a review of your tools and provide you with some outcome through the Quality Assurance Committee, or you will be randomly selected for the tool review and the peer practice review. We will take time and pause through the session and open up for questions. However, Lena's going to talk to you a little bit about frequently asked questions that we've heard so far at the end of our session. Next slide.
Sure.
Okay. So first I just want to explain to you where this legislative obligation, both the college's obligation and role in quality assurance and your obligation in QA. Under the Regulated Health Professions Act, every college regulated under this act, every regulatory health college, is required to ensure they have a quality assurance program. And this QA program has to have a self-assessment, a peer, and practice assessment. We also have to make sure that our members engage in professional development and or continuing education. And part of this requirement from the college's perspective is we have to have a mechanism to monitor your engagement in these activities. And so it doesn't matter what college you are part of. If you are working with, so for example, nursing has the very similar or the same legislative obligations. The physicians do, the kinesiologists, the occupational therapists, and of course now you guys do, being under the Regulated Health Professions Act. Okay, the next slide. Some of the key principles of the QA program we want to emphasize is that we do expect it to be self-directed. So we want to give you the tools to help you explore your own learning needs and also identify your own strengths. So we want the tools to be very relevant to your practice, and given the nature of this profession, how broad it is, we want to make sure that the tools are flexible enough to be relevant to all the individual's members. We want to be able to have opportunity for self-reflection, that you can have some aha moments. You didn't know what you didn't know. Maybe you weren't aware that there was specific legislation around confidentiality and privacy. So we want to be able to inform you of specific professional obligations and you to be able to reflect on how those obligations impact your practice. The QA program is confidential in nature, which means that when you complete your professional development tools or if you engage in a peer and practice assessment, those results and those documents are maintained with only the QA program and the committee. So we cannot use any of those results in any other college proceedings. So if there's a complaint made against you and the college is investigating that client complaint, then we cannot disclose or we not share with the ICRC committee those results from QA. Your information that we gather in QA does not get posted on the college's website, so public, your clients wouldn't see that information. Employers cannot request and have access to that information. We also want the QA program to be educational in nature, so it really is a proactive approach to help you identify potential learning needs and, of course, celebrate the strengths. And it's intended to be proactive versus reactive, so not to engage you in learning when only if there's a problem, but also to support the interest of the public that you are truly maintaining competence, that it didn't just occur upon initial registration, that throughout your career you are continuing to learn and implement that learning in your practice. And again, that speaks to the public's confidence in the profession. The two-way process is the college is learning from you guys, that through the collated data, we can identify where membership is requiring additional learning. So if we identify that a large percentage of people are requiring more information around consent or documentation or confidentiality and privacy, we can then look at implementing specific educational materials, developing new standards, hosting webinars. So we want to be able to use the collated data that we collect in the QA program to inform college processes, again, as a proactive educational process. The tools are also founded on the consciously competent model, which has you think about and reflect on your day-to-day practice. So how can you consciously demonstrate knowledge, skill, and judgment versus just status quo, maintaining what knowledge you know without thinking about the impact to your practice or potential changes in your practice environment, new technologies, new standards of practice. We also recognize that some people don't know what they don't know. So if I didn't know that there was legislation around the consent, the Healthcare Consent Act, I wouldn't know what those parameters are to make appropriate changes to my learning plan or to my documentation around consent. So by implementing tools to help you identify the potential key aspects for your professional obligation brings you to that consciously competent practitioner. We also want you to explore the use of self, where you evaluate your own values, beliefs, emotional and experiential your experiences in your practice that help enhance your practice or where you need to maybe make changes in your practice. The purpose of the QA program, as we talked about, is about self-awareness and reflection and how you can enhance your practice to promote that continuous learning. How can you collaborate with peers and colleagues and other disciplines to continue maintaining your competence and enhancing your practice? Under the Regulated Health Professions Act, the QA program is also to address changes in your practice environment. So we want you to consider potential changes, any new clients that you may be seeing. Maybe you've changed jobs and now have a new focus or a new clientele. What new technologies or trends are occurring in the practice environment? Maybe you're now dealing with a younger population, a teenage population who only communicates by email or texting. How does that impact privacy legislation, your privacy obligations? And then, of course, any changes to standards or legislation we want you to be aware of. So the Quality Assurance Program is intended to support this self-awareness, reflection, encourage enhancement, and address any changes in the practice environment, technology, or standards of practice.
And just to add to that, in the broader context of assuring the public that you're maintaining your knowledge, skill, and judgment, and enhancing your knowledge, skill, and judgment.
That's an important aspect to consider, that now that you are part of a regulatory college, there is professional obligations both from the college's stance and also from your perspective, that now that you have the registration status, the public does expect that you are competent practitioners, that the college is confirming that part of you maintaining your registration means that you're still competent practitioners, even beyond the day of registration. So to help meet this legislative obligation of having a self-peer practice assessment and to ensure that you engage in continuing professional development, the college has developed 3 components of the QA program. The first component is what we're talking about today. So I'm not going to give you a lot of detail right now, but it's professional development. And that is a requirement that all members have to engage in professional development if you're an active member of the college. So it doesn't matter that if you are currently not practicing, maybe you're on maternity leave or a sick leave, or you're in the midst of changing jobs. If you're currently registered as an active member, you are required to engage in professional development. If you're working part-time or just as a consultant, again, you're still required to do the tools that we're going to be talking about. The peer and practice review you're going to hear a little bit about today, but that is based on a random selection, that every year the college is going to randomly select members to engage in the peer and practice review, which is a 2-step process. And it's engaging you first in a remote interview and some document submission, and then some members will be asked to go on to a more in-depth assessment with a face-to-face interview with the peer assessor. For those members that engage in a peer practice review, if the committee identifies a lack of knowledge, skill, or judgment, then they'll ask you to engage in professional improvement. And that professional improvement is really a remedial program. They may ask you to read a standard and maybe potentially write a note or a document around how that standard impacts your practice. They may ask you to engage in a course or do some online learning, complete a learning plan that the committee has structured, maybe even engage in some activities with a mentor. So that is the proactive approach, that if we identify, the college identifies through the peer and practice review some knowledge deficits or a lack of skill and judgment, that we want to help you and support you in enhancing your practice. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so this is where I'll take over. You're hearing Lena's voice, and I'll be talking about the professional development tools themselves. All right, so this is just a very broad overview of the requirements in a general sense, and we're going to drill down into this a little bit later on. So generally every 2 years, members are expected to complete the self-assessment tool. And this tool is broken up into 3 parts. Now we're going to walk through the tools in a minute, so just bear with me while I give you the overview. Section 1 is the general professional obligations inventory, and Section 2 is called reflection, and Section 3 is called contemplation and internal exploration. The other tool is the learning plan, and this is where members document goals and a course of action. And the final tool, the third tool, is the record of continuing professional development. And members will use this to track any learning activities that they've engaged in. You probably know this already, but if you registered between April 1st and September 30th, then you're in the pool of people to participate and submit the professional development tools. And the deadline for that is March 31st, 2016. Those who register after on or after October 1st submit their tools in 2017 in that time period. Now it's funny because one of the first and most frequent questions that I received from members was, my registration date falls after September 30th. Is it really true that I don't have to participate? Some people are actually incredulous that they don't have to participate, and it's true. So if you registered after October 1st, you don't need to submit the tools. Though I have been telling people, if you want to use the tools for your own purposes on your own time, that's up to you. But you don't have to submit them, and you don't have to meet this deadline by any means. But again, clearly, if you register between April 1st and September 30th, then you're required to submit by March 31st of this year. So this is the summary of the pilot requirements. For that self-assessment tool, basically, members are told to complete it according to the instructions. And you'll see what I mean when we walk through the tools. Because there are 3 sections, you have to sort of make sure you connect your responses with what's being asked. There is the learning plan, and the requirement for the learning plan is to document at least one goal and record your plan, and then to complete the reflection related to the goal. We'll talk more about that. And then there's the record of continuing professional development, and the requirement for that is to report at least one learning activity that takes place between January 1st and March 31st of this year, so 2016. And to bring this all together and loop it back, members are asked to submit these tools by March 31st, 2016. And submission happens by logging into your account on the system, so your CRPO account, and navigating to the QA tab. And when you scroll down that page, you'll see there's a section called Submit, Manage Your QA Documents, and you'll find a little uploader tool there that will help you upload the tools. Okay, so now we're going to walk through the tools themselves. So when you open them up, you're going to see exactly what's on my screen here. The first 2 pages give a little bit of context for the professional development component of the quality assurance program. This introduction explains a lot of what Leanne talked about earlier on in the presentation. There's a summary of the pilot test participation requirements in the next section. And there's an important little bit here that right at the bottom of the page that sometimes people miss. And it's about using the tools and getting started with the tools, which is that when you go into your account, I should also mention you can access the tools by logging into your CRPO account and finding your way to the QA tab. So once you click on that QA tab, you're going to see a brief introduction, and then you'll see 3 links. And the first link is the tools, the second link is the guide, and the third link is going to be to the survey. Also a description of the review process. I'm not going to go through that right now because we're going to talk about that a little later in the presentation. And then your ongoing requirements. This directs you to review the professional development guide. Again, that's the second link on under your CRPO account under the QA tab. So by the time we get to the 3rd page, we're seeing the introduction to the self-assessment tool. And here we are on the 4th page, which is where the forms start. So have a close look at the instructions. Basically, the instructions just say, well, read the indicators. And I should mention this tool is divided up into sections. So you have your legal and professional obligations in section 1. Section 2, I'm scrolling through now, so if you have a look at your screen, you should be able to see that. Section 2 is record keeping. Section 3 is business practices. And Section 4 is clinical practice. And then professional development and workplace setting. So your job mainly here is to have a look section by section and read the indicator. So I've already done 1 and 2, so maybe I'll jump down to 3. I'll walk you through how you can interact with the form. So under section 1, legal and professional obligations, question 3, it says, I know when my professional limitations require that I seek clinical supervision and or a consultation with a colleague. So when you're trying to respond to these questions, you can think about it solely from your own experience and reflecting on what you know and your level of knowledge, skill, or judgment. And we're also asking you in the instructions, we ask you to consider relevant information from other sources. So, maybe think about feedback that you've received from clients or colleagues, or maybe you sat in on a course and that stimulated some reflection on your knowledge, skill, or judgment in a particular area, or maybe even something a supervisor has said to you. So the gist is, have you seen this as a learning need, or how would you rate yourself on this, or have other people provided you with feedback that would have an impact on your rating? So you could score yourself. Maybe you want to score yourself as a 2, that, okay, I'm not really sure about my limitations. Or maybe you feel very strong in this area, and so you want to score yourself as a 4 or a 5. If you score yourself as a 2 or a 3, let's put 3 here, but you're feeling like you have some blind spots, for example, maybe you've decided this is a learning need. So then you could go here in column C and click on, yeah, this is a learning need. I want to highlight this. And here you can make a decision. It's up to you if you know how you want to use this column, but maybe you want to add this to your learning plan. Develop greater awareness of my blind spots by receiving maybe more clinical consultation, or maybe some more supervision with a colleague. So you could say add it to my learning plan, and so I'm just picking examples out of thin air. They may not be the best examples, but here they are. So this is a sample of a kind of note you could make to yourself about adding it to your learning plan, and where exactly you want to explore the learning, the focus of the learning. So you would walk through in a similar way, one by one. Now, don't feel beholden. Even if you rate yourself that you need development, don't feel beholden to identifying everything as a learning need. It may not be the case. You might even want to open up the professional practice standards and have them beside you while you're flipping through this, so that you can see what you know or what you don't know. Or if you don't have time then for that, then you could just use column D to make notes and keep track of things that you want to go back and study independently. And then if you decide you wanted to make a goal about your obligations, you could just connect that back to the learning plan, and we'll talk about doing that after. Something I want to point out here too, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but this is a self-rating. This is you looking at your own scores and applying a value that is meaningful to your own self-rating. The college isn't going to judge whether you've rated yourself a 1 or a 5. It makes no difference to us. What the college cares about is that you're doing this, and you're doing this thoughtfully and with intentionality. Okay, so I'll just, I don't think I'll give any more examples. What I'll do is just sort of explain some of the pieces that are under record keeping, and show you some of the differences in the questions, so that you can understand how to maximize this tool. So record keeping just goes through some of the record keeping standards, and you'll see in some questions that they're multi-part, and there's a little list. Here what we're looking for is that you're actually doing all these things, because that's connected to the standard. So if there's something here that you're not doing, or you're not doing it regularly, you may consider incorporating that into your score here, and maybe pulling it out as a learning need. Or maybe you have the guide beside you, and reading the guide was sufficient. So maybe you want to change your rating, and it's no longer a learning need, because you already did your learning while you were filling this out. Okay, so in business practices, it deals with things like billing, advertising, contingency planning. And we have question 6 under business practices, which is about compliance with laws relevant to a business. So if you're a member who is in private practice, then you should be aware, whoops, sorry, my scrolling skittered away from me. There we go. You should be aware that there's legislation that impacts your practice. And so you would check off any that apply to you. And maybe there are others that are missed here. that's okay. But just to get a sense of those pieces of legislation that are relevant to your practice. Maybe you're a partner in a clinic, and you need to be aware of some of these things but not others, then this is something that would apply to you as well. If you work for an agency, maybe this question doesn't apply to you at all. So that's an important piece to remember, that if something doesn't apply to you, there is a not applicable option that you could select. So under clinical practice, this section deals with questions around confidentiality, privacy, and consent, whether a client's capacity to provide consent, discontinuing services, and professional development is about feedback and taking on opportunities for learning, and then workplace setting relates to diversity. So that's the walkthrough, the self-assessment. And maybe what I'll do is walk through this first tool before I open the floor to questions. My review of the reflection section and the contemplation section will be quite short. So here, follow the questions carefully. You're going to notice that there's groupings of questions. So there's grouping A, I'll scroll through, there's grouping B, and then on the next page there's grouping C. The instruction to members is just to select one and provide a short answer response to one question from each grouping. So you're going to select one from group A, one from group B, and one from group C. And you know, I won't give you samples of good responses here because there's really no such thing as a perfect answer. As long as you're providing an answer that is coherent, it's not a cookie recipe, it's something that's in your own words, so you're not lifting and copying and pasting text from somewhere else, then that's good. And you can keep your answers short. We don't really want you to do more than you have to with these tools. So even despite all these instructions, don't feel like you have to go and write in things everywhere. If it doesn't apply to you, select that. If you don't feel it's a learning need, don't check off the box. You don't have to make this form harder than it has to be. And then you have the option to add the response, or sorry, maybe something in your response has triggered a learning need, and so you could select this checkbox to add it to your learning plan. And these are notes, basically, these checkboxes. Think of them as notes for you later on, because when you go to do your learning plan, you'll be able to just quickly scan your self-assessment and look where you've identified a learning need, and you can kind of review that and pull that into your learning plan. Okay, so section B, and then section C, you'd select one of these as well and provide a short answer response. Now finally, part 3 is the contemplation and internal exploration component. And you know, self-assessments, we've heard feedback from a lot of members that this can make a person feel very vulnerable, and I can really relate to that. And part 3, when the committee sat down and looked at the questions that landed in part 3, they thought these questions might make a person feel especially vulnerable. And so the thinking was that it might be a really nice approach to, instead of have people write responses or be required to write a response, that people are just asked to do thinking and spend some time thinking about each of the questions that you see here. And because we heard feedback because we took these tools out for pre-testing and with some focus groups, originally we didn't have any space at all to record notes or identify it as a learning need. There were just 3 questions written out with no opportunity to provide any kind of response to them. But we heard feedback that people may want to keep notes, or some people may even want to write a response. So that is entirely up to you. You can just read the questions and do your contemplation, or maybe you want to make notes for yourself, maybe you want to write your response, or maybe you want to write your response in a Word document and keep that privately. How you use this section is fully up to you. And then again, you have this cue to add it to your learning plan. Okay, so that's finished. That's the walkthrough of the self-assessment. I'm wondering, before I open the floor for questions, Leanne, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nope, I think that's great.
Okay. Thanks. Now I'm wondering if the group has questions. If you
When we're finished filling it out, do we just upload a copy? Because if the form's already there, where do we put our finished from the computer copy? And how do you want us to save it and such, please?
Yeah, that's a good question. So even though it's available on the when you log into your CRPO account and you go to the QA tab, yes, there is a version there. But when you scroll a little bit down the QA page, you'll see a section called Manage/Submit Your QA Documents. Or submit, manage your QA documents. And there you'll find an uploader tool, and it'll walk you through all those steps to get your tool uploaded.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see a question. Okay, you're welcome. I see a question here from Catherine. And the question is, in the contemplation section, if we write our responses and then download to the CRPO site, won't those answers be downloaded too? So I'm just going to scroll us back, the group back, to make it really clear where we are. So we're in the contemplation section here, and this is what the question is asking about. So if you write your answer here, then and then it's uploaded, won't we be able to see it? You know, maybe the college staff that are reviewing it, and that's correct. So this isn't a private section. This really, it's up to you if you want to write something there, if at all. And maybe you don't want to write an answer there, but maybe you want to make notes about what your learning should be. It's really up to you to decide how to use these notes sections. We just sort of thought it would be, based on the feedback we heard in the pre-testing, we thought it would be a good idea to have that section there in case people decided they wanted to add some information in, whether it's a note, whether it's their actual response.
It's a really great learning tool, though, even if we're ever in a situation and somebody asks us about our profession.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a good point. Sometimes we get a lot of comments around, we have to do a very similar process for our employer as part of our annual performance review. We do encourage you that if you want to, not duplicate your efforts, you can definitely share your responses with your employer. The college doesn't do that for confidential reasons. On the flip side, if your employer has a different tool, you can't submit that to the college as part of your QA. You actually do have to fill out these tools because we have a specific focus around the standards and specific legislation. And your employer might not have the same requirements. So that being said, though, we do hope that the tools are very interactive in that if you do have professional obligations at work, that you can share and use some of your responses for that purpose as well.
Okay, so I had another question that was typed in, and someone has asked about responding to the questions, and based on the question, I get the impression this person is not in a private practice. So, and I think it was question 6 under business practices that stimulated this question. So about complying to relevant laws or laws relevant to the operation of a business, and the person asked, so I can just check off NA if I'm not in a private practice. And it's maybe, I'm going to say maybe. So here's the thing, you have to read each of these indicators, or each of the, well, yeah, they're indicators, and you need to think about whether or not it applies to you. And if it doesn't apply to you, then you can select NA. And I'm sort of thinking about this, take away the whole practice setting context, just think if it applies to you, and then base your response on that. And the reason why is maybe you worked in a hospital setting, and maybe there's because of the department you're in, something from one of these acts does apply to you. So I wouldn't want to just give it a blanket answer. So I'm saying to use your judgment and to really think through whether or not something applies to you, and then you can, or does not apply to you, and then if it doesn't, select NA. Okay, so we're going to get to the learning plan, and I see a question here about the learning plan, and I think when we get to that, that it will answer the question. And if the question remains, the asker can just type it in again or remind me. Okay, so let's go down here. All right, so here we are with the learning plan. And you'll see again, as all these tools do, they start off with a set of instructions. And here in the instructions, it asks you to fill in the learning plan and document information in each column. So the first column is identifying the goal. The second column is laying out a plan, and the third column is the reflection. And I'll go in a little more detail. I'm not going to fill in a response here again because I don't want to give the impression that there's a perfect way to do this. So I'll just do this verbally and give you some examples. So when you're thinking about your goals, you can use your self-assessment, which has identified your learning needs. You can sit back and think about other learning needs that may not have come up as a result of the self-assessment, but things that you've been sort of mulling over, or maybe you just have professional goals that you've been wanting to achieve. I have a member contacted me recently because she's in a program right now, and she's completing her program, a master's level degree, and she said, "Oh, I'm doing this. What do I do?" And I said, "Well, why don't you document it as a learning goal, and then lay out the steps that you need to do under the plan column to finalize that goal." And then, you know, maybe you haven't reached the goal by the time you submit it, because I think her program is done at the end of the summer. So then because you're submitting it in March, then you just talk about the progress towards reaching your goal and how that's impacted your practice. So goals, they can be as large in scope as you want them to be, or they can be small in scope. If you're a person who likes to take things in small steps, maybe you want to itemize some of those items that you've identified as learning needs in your self-assessment and write them in here. You know, I want to learn more about mandatory reporting, for example, or I'm going to read up on consent or privacy and look up the privacy legislation and see how it impacts me. And so you just write out how you do that. Or maybe you're a person who thinks at a broader level and you just want to make a more general goal. I want to learn more about my obligations as a member of the college, and then you just lay out the broad higher level steps that you would do to achieve that. So under the plan column, it sort of gives you some bullets to help cue you up about the information that you could include in your plan. So resources that you might require, whether you might need help or collaboration, supervision maybe, and then whether there might be some challenges to obtaining your goal. And the requirement for the pilot is that you document at least one goal. Could be one of those small ones, could be one of the broad ones, it's up to you. At least one. If you want to put down more, that's great, but you don't have to. So keeping in mind that there's that bare minimum, you can put in at least one. Leanne, is there anything else?
Sure. Just that some people, just to elaborate on what Elena said about small goals and larger goals, if you had a large goal around, you know, the increasing awareness of the Healthcare Consent Act, your plan might be breaking that down in smaller pieces. So you're going to review the legislation, you're going to look at the college's specific materials on the website, you're going to look at how you need to make changes to your consent form, how you document. That's one kind of large goal. You could look at a small goal, for example, is how to, maybe your goal is to make modifications to your documentation and your informed consent process as per the legislation. So that's still a small goal. The plan could be very similar, that you are reviewing the legislation, updating your consent forms, looking at your documentation materials. So again, the goal doesn't have to be this huge project. And if it is, then you can break it down into chunk-sized pieces in the plan, and then the reflection piece. And you may not meet that goal that year. That's absolutely okay. and if you, whatever you have got accomplished is where you focus the reflection on.
Yeah, and I think that's Leanne brings up a really good point about goals, because I've been asked by members, well, you know, do I have to fit the goals in your time frame box? You know, something that is achievable by by March 31st, 2016, or, you know, I have to submit again in 2017. So by that time, the answer is no. You know, the goals, they're on your own time frame. We're just asking you to sort of document them here, document your plan here, and then keep us updated about your progress. And that the way you do that is just by submitting these tools every 2 years and documenting your changes. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and specifically what that looks like later. Okay, so maybe this is a good time to ask if anyone has questions. So somebody asked, my registration was in 2015, so do I have to do this again next year? And that's a really good question. We'll talk in a little more detail about submitting it and the schedule a little bit later on. It just depends on your registration number. That's the short answer I'm going to give you, and I'll give you more information about that.
I had a question. It's just about records, because through this process I have been updating my records and making changes in the way I do certain things. And I'm wondering around, for example, the records that I have pre-college, because from what I read, it sounds like it sounds as if all our records, even pre-existence of the college, will be up for review as well.
Right. Leanne, I'm wondering if you want to answer that.
So can you repeat the question? I just want to understand what you mean by other documents.
Well, it's through this process I have been for example, I'm being a little tighter around the way I keep my records, around including email, around there's been a bit of a learning process.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my record keeping presently is in line with the requirements of the college.
Sure. So,
but it's been a process.
Right. So as part of the professional development tool review process, we would not be asking for your clinical records. We wouldn't be looking at you submitting those to the college if you're just been selected for professional development review. If, however, you're randomly selected for a peer and practice review, then that's when the college can and will ask to review some of the clinical records. Not looking at, you know, what you've documented specifically for that client, but basically how have you documented and how have you implemented processes to meet standards of practice. So at this time, we're not asking you to submit any of that as part of evidence of your learning. We don't need to see consent forms or anything like that unless the college asks for it at a later time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I turned off my button. Yes, I think it does actually. Maybe I could ask also though, should we be going back in time to upgrade our past records if we need? I don't know.
No,
or should we just move forward from the present?
Move forward from the present. That's the purpose here. We're not going to sort of reach back into looking at the past. It's not, you weren't regulated at that time. It's not fair really to do that, or to even, it would be far too onerous to even have that expectation.
Yes.
Yeah, as much as possible, quality assurance is something that either looks at the time that you're in and your plans for yourself going forward. That's what quality assurance focuses on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure how the committee still has to set parameters around the review of records. And I suspect one of the parameters will be around the date, you know, that the record, you know, a timing of a record, that we look at a thing from April 1st, 2015. Okay, so I have a few more questions. I think I'll just answer these two, and then we'll continue on. So somebody is asking if we record our goals for the year, an entire year, but only reflect on the first goal. And maybe this answers this, because these are, okay, so and a second person is asking a similar question. The person's wondering about the time frame in general for goals, and are they supposed to write a goal just for the end of March of this year, or does it need to look forward until 2018? Those are really good questions. I'm going to say this. In a way, it's up to you. The requirement is for the pilot, which is the pilot of these tools that I'm showing you today, is just that you document at least one goal, that you write in a plan, and that you reflect on that by March 31st. If you wanted to extend this tool further into the future, you're entirely welcome to, and up until your next submission period, whether it's going to be 2017 or 18, it's entirely up to you. So remember, the minimum for the pilot is just one goal. If you want to reach further into that and look ahead till your next submission date, you're welcome to do that too, but knowing it's a bit above and beyond the pilot.